The leather-bound volumes scattered across Samuel Quinn's ranch house floor told the story of a man who had lost control of more than just his library. And when the slender woman with auburn hair stepped through his doorway on that sweltering June morning in 1883, he knew his carefully constructed solitude was about to crumble. "Mr. Quinn." Her voice carried the educated tones of someone who had spent time back east, though her practical wool traveling dress was dusty from the stagecoach journey through Nevada's desert landscape. "I am Margaret Daniels. You placed an advertisement for a librarian." Samuel stood from where he had been pretending to organize papers at his massive oak desk, his tall frame unfolding to its full height of 6 feet 2 inches. At 28 years old, he had the weathered look of a man who had spent his life under the relentless sun, though his hands told a different story. They were calloused from ranch work, yes, but ink stains marked his fingers, and there was a gentleness in how he handled the books stacked precariously on every available surface. "Miss Daniels." He cleared his throat, suddenly aware of how long it had been since he had entertained a guest, particularly a woman. "Yes, I did. Though I will be honest, I did not expect anyone to actually respond, especially not someone with your obvious qualifications." Margaret stepped further into the main room of the ranch house, her hazel eyes widening as she took in the sheer volume of literature that filled every corner. Books lined makeshift shelves constructed from planks and crates. They teetered in stacks against walls, lay open on tables, and spilled from trunks that had traveled from who knew where. She counted volumes in at least 4 languages just from what she could see at first glance. "Good heavens," she breathed. "This is extraordinary. I had no idea anyone in Nevada City possessed such a collection." "My father was a scholar before he became a rancher," Samuel explained, moving to clear a chair for her, though he had to remove 3 books and a leather journal first. He never could decide which life suited him better, so he tried to live both. When he passed 2 years ago, he left me this ranch, 500 head of cattle, and approximately 3,000 books in complete disarray. Margaret accepted the seat, placing her small traveling bag at her feet. She was 24, and though she tried to present herself as purely professional, Samuel could not help but notice the gentle curve of her neck, the intelligence that sparkled in her eyes, and the way her lips pursed thoughtfully as she surveyed the chaos around them. 3,000 books is quite a responsibility," she said carefully. "The advertisement mentioned room and board in addition to a salary. I assume the position is residential." "The bunkhouse has been empty since my ranch hands built their own cabins closer to the grazing land," Samuel replied, forcing himself to focus on the practical matters at hand rather than the way late morning light caught the red highlights in her hair. "It has a good stove, a decent bed, and windows that catch the cross breeze. It is not fancy, but it is clean and private. You would take your meals here in the main house if that is acceptable. And the work itself," Samuel gestured helplessly at the surrounding chaos. "I want them cataloged, organized, and properly shelved. I have been trying for 2 years to make sense of my father's system, if he even had one, and I have only made matters worse. I can barely find anything when I need it, and I am terrified that the valuable ones are getting damaged in these conditions." Margaret rose and walked to the nearest stack, carefully extracting a volume from the middle with the practiced care of someone who truly understood books. She examined the spine, opened to the title page, and ran her fingers along the binding with a tenderness that made Samuel's breath catch unexpectedly. "First edition Whitman," she murmured. 1855. "This alone is worth more than most people in Nevada City earn in a year." She looked up at him with new understanding. "You are not exaggerating about the value of this collection. These need proper care immediately. Then you will take the position." She hesitated, and in that moment, Samuel saw something flicker across her face. Uncertainty, perhaps, or maybe the shadow of whatever had brought an educated young woman alone to the wilds of Nevada territory in the first place. He had not asked in his advertisement, and he would not pry now, but everyone who came west was running from something or toward something. Sometimes both. "I will take it," Margaret said finally, "on the condition that I have complete authority over the organization system. I cannot work if you are going to question every decision I make about categorization." "You will have free rein," Samuel promised, relief flooding through him. "I am barely here anyway. The ranch keeps me occupied from dawn until well past dusk most days. The books were my father's passion. I just want to preserve them properly in his memory." They settled on a salary of $20 a month plus room and board, which was generous for the work but seemed fair given the scope of the project and her evident expertise. Samuel showed her to the bunkhouse, carrying her single traveling bag and trying not to wonder why a woman of her obvious education and refinement owned so few possessions. The bunkhouse was indeed clean. A simple rectangular building with a wood floor, 4 windows that could be opened for ventilation, a cast iron stove, a bed frame with a thick mattress, a table with 2 chairs, and a wardrobe for clothing. Margaret ran her hand along the windowsill, checking for dust more out of habit than expectation, and found none. "This will do nicely," she said. "Thank you, Mr. Quinn." "Samuel, please. If we are going to be sharing meals and working in proximity, formality seems unnecessary." "Then you must call me Margaret." She turned to face him, and for a moment they simply looked at one another, 2 people alone in the vast Nevada desert, brought together by books and circumstance. "When would you like me to start?" "Tomorrow is soon enough. Get settled, rest from your journey." "I will have my cook, Chen, prepare something special for dinner tonight to welcome you properly." That evening, Margaret discovered that Samuel had not been exaggerating about his Chinese cook's abilities. Chen had come to Nevada during the railroad construction boom, and stayed when he discovered he preferred cooking to laying track. He served them pan-fried trout caught fresh from the Carson River, vegetables from his carefully tended garden, and rice prepared with a delicate seasoning that Margaret could not identify but found delicious. Samuel and Margaret ate at opposite ends of the long dining table, the distance between them filled with books and papers that had accumulated there. The conversation was cautious at first, circling around safe topics like the weather and the quality of the meal, but gradually they found their way to more substantial ground. "What brought you to library work?" Samuel asked, refilling her glass of water from the pitcher. Margaret took a moment before answering, her fingers tracing the pattern on her plate. "My father was a professor in Boston, history and classical literature. I grew up in his library at the university, and books became more real to me than most people. When he died, my mother remarried quickly. My stepfather believed education was wasted on women and tried to marry me off to a business associate of his, a man 3 times my age who wanted a decorative wife to show off at parties." She met Samuel's eyes steadily. "I declined the honor and left Boston with what money I had saved. I have been working my way west ever since, taking positions where I can find them." "I am sorry," Samuel said quietly, "about your father and about your stepfather's treatment. Do not be. It led me here, which seems fortuitous now that I have seen your collection." She paused, then asked, "And what about you? Why does a cattle rancher need 3,000 books?" Samuel leaned back in his chair, a wistful expression crossing his sun-bronzed features. "I do not need them. I need the cattle, the ranch, the water rights, all the practical things that keep a man alive and solvent in this country. But the books remind me that there is more to existence than survival. My father used to say that a man could be both civilized and frontier, that we did not have to choose between literature and livestock. I am trying to honor that, even though I am not sure I believe it the way he did. Why do you doubt it? Because civilization and the frontier seem to want different things from a person. Out here, strength matters more than sensitivity. Action matters more than contemplation. There is not much call for poetry when you are pulling a calf in a difficult birth or defending your water rights from claim jumpers. Margaret considered this, her intelligent eyes studying him with new interest. Perhaps that is exactly when poetry matters most. When life is harsh, beauty becomes essential rather than optional. Something shifted in the air between them, a recognition of kindred spirits that neither had expected to find. They talked until the candles burned low, until Chen had long since retired to his own cabin, and the night sounds of the Nevada desert filtered through the open windows. They discussed literature and philosophy, ranching and survival, the tension between dreams and practicality that seemed to define life in the West. When Margaret finally excused herself to retire to the bunkhouse, Samuel walked her across the yard under a sky so thick with stars it seemed impossible. The Milky Way stretched overhead like a river of light, and somewhere in the distance, a coyote called out its lonely song. "Thank you for the conversation," Margaret said softly as they reached her door. "I had forgotten what it was like to talk about ideas with someone who cared about them." "Thank you for taking this position," Samuel replied. "I think you might be saving more than just my library." She looked at him curiously, but did not ask him to elaborate, simply wished him good night and slipped inside. Samuel stood in the yard for a long moment after her door closed, looking up at the stars and wondering what exactly he had set in motion by bringing this woman into his carefully isolated life. Margaret began work the next morning with a methodology that Samuel found both impressive and slightly intimidating. She appeared at the main house just after dawn, already dressed in a simple but practical cotton dress with the sleeves rolled up and her auburn hair pinned severely back. She carried a notebook, several pencils, and a determined expression. "I will need supplies," she announced over breakfast. "Proper shelving, labels, a card catalog system, cleaning materials, and possibly some restoration supplies for the books that are in poor condition." Samuel nearly choked on his coffee. "How much is this going to cost me?" "Less than you would lose if this collection continues to deteriorate," she replied tartly. "But if you prefer, I can make do with what is available locally and improvise the rest. It will simply take longer and the result will be less professional." "No, you are right. Make a list. I will have Chen drive into Virginia City next week for whatever you need that we cannot get in Nevada City. It is only about 15 miles and they have better suppliers there." For the next 3 days, Margaret did nothing but assess the collection, moving through the house with her notebook and making careful records. She handled each volume with reverence, noting its condition, approximate value, and subject matter. Samuel found himself watching her work whenever he came inside, fascinated by the complete absorption with which she approached each book. On the 4th day, he found her sitting cross-legged on the floor in front of his father's old desk, tears streaming down her face as she read a slim volume bound in cracked leather. Alarmed, he crossed the room quickly and knelt beside her. "Margaret, what is wrong? Are you hurt?" She looked up at him with swimming eyes and laughed, a sound somewhere between joy and sorrow. "Your father had a first edition of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnets from the Portuguese. You know how rare this is, how beautiful." She read aloud, her voice thick with emotion. How do I love thee? Let me count the ways. I love thee to the depth and breadth and height my soul can reach. Samuel sat back on his heels, relief and something else flooding through him. He loved that poem. My mother died when I was young, and he used to read it every year on their anniversary. I had forgotten he kept the book. Margaret carefully closed the volume and cradled it against her chest. I am sorry. I am being foolish, crying over poetry. But sometimes the beauty of something just overwhelms you, you know. I do know, Samuel said softly, though he was not entirely sure he was still talking about the book. They sat together on the floor surrounded by the chaos of literature and loss, two people finding unexpected connection in a house full of words. After a moment, Margaret carefully set the Browning aside and wiped her eyes. Forgive me. I am supposed to be professional. I would rather you be genuine, Samuel replied. Professional is easy to find. Genuine is rare. Over the following weeks, a routine established itself. Samuel rose before dawn to work the ranch, dealing with the endless demands of cattle, land, and the hired hands who worked his spread. Margaret emerged from the bunkhouse shortly after first light and lost herself in the books until Chen called them for meals. They ate breakfast in companionable silence, both too focused on the day ahead for much conversation. Lunch was usually just sandwiches or leftovers that Margaret ate while she worked. But dinner became something they both looked forward to, a time to set aside work and talk about everything and nothing. Samuel found himself hurrying through his evening chores, eager to wash up and sit across the table from Margaret. She challenged him in ways no one had since his father died, asking questions about the ranch that made him think more deeply about what he was doing and why. She had opinions about water management and grazing rotation gleaned from books, some of which were surprisingly practical when he thought them through. In turn, he asked about her progress with the library, and her face would light up as she described her organizational system. She had decided to arrange the books primarily by subject, with subsections for language and chronology where relevant. Fiction was separated from non-fiction, and within fiction, she created categories for different genres. She had found books on mathematics, natural sciences, history, philosophy, religion, poetry, drama, and novels in English, French, Latin, and Greek. Your father had incredibly diverse interests, she said one evening over Chen's excellent beef stew. I found veterinary texts next to Virgil, agricultural manuals beside Shakespeare, books on mining engineering shelved with Milton. It is like he wanted to understand everything about both the practical world and the world of ideas. That was exactly what he wanted, Samuel confirmed. He used to say that a Renaissance man should be able to deliver a calf, recite Homer, repair a wagon wheel, and debate philosophy, all with equal competence. And can you? Margaret asked with a slight smile. Samuel considered. I can manage the calf and the wagon wheel. I am rusty on Homer and would probably lose the philosophy debate to you fairly quickly. I doubt that. You are far more well-read than you give yourself credit for. I have noticed you picking up the books I leave out in the evening. It was true. Samuel had started reading whatever Margaret was cataloging each day, curious about what was capturing her attention. Last night, it had been Thoreau's Walden, and he had found himself surprisingly moved by the philosopher's thoughts on simple living and self-reliance, even if Thoreau's version of wilderness seemed rather tame compared to the Nevada desert. They make me think of my father, Samuel admitted. When I read them, I can almost hear his voice explaining things to me the way he used to when I was young, before he got so focused on building up the ranch that there was no time for anything else. What changed? Samuel was quiet for a moment, pushing stew around his plate. There was a drought, 4 years where the rain just stopped coming, We lost more than half the herd. My father borrowed money to keep us going and then spent the rest of his life working to pay it back. The books became his escape, I think, from the weight of debt and worry. But there was no time to organize them properly or even really enjoy them. He would just read in snatches, late at night when he should have been sleeping. "That is unbearably sad," Margaret said softly. "He paid off the debt 6 months before he died." Heart gave out one afternoon while he was checking fence line. I found him at sunset. Samuel set down his fork, his appetite gone with the memory. "I kept thinking he should have had more time, time to actually appreciate what he had built, what he had saved. Time to read his books in daylight instead of by candlelight, when he was too exhausted to properly take them in." Margaret reached across the table and placed her hand over his, a gesture of comfort that sent warmth through his entire body. "You are giving him that time now by preserving and honoring his collection. That matters." Her hand was small and delicate, but he could feel calluses forming from handling so many books. He turned his palm up to properly hold her hand, marveling at how natural it felt. "Thank you," he said, "for understanding." They sat like that for several heartbeats, hands clasped across the table, before Margaret gently withdrew with a slight blush coloring her cheeks. The moment passed, but something had been acknowledged between them, a tenderness growing alongside their daily companionship. The supplies arrived from Virginia City in late July, delivered by freight wagon along with Samuel's monthly supplies. Margaret threw herself into the construction of her cataloging system with even more energy. Samuel hired 2 of his ranch hands to build proper floor-to-ceiling shelving along 3 walls of the main room, following Margaret's exact specifications for spacing and depth. She worked alongside the men, not afraid to hammer nails or sand rough edges, her sleeves rolled up and her hair falling loose from its pins as the day progressed. Samuel came in from the south pasture to check on the progress and found himself transfixed by the sight of her, laughing at something one of the hands had said, a smudge of sawdust across her cheek and vitality radiating from her. "Boss, you want us to continue these shelves into your office too?" One of the hands called out, breaking Samuel's reverie. "What does Margaret think?" Samuel asked, deferring to her expertise. "I think it would be ideal," she said, consulting her notebook. "I have at least 500 volumes that would be best housed in a private study rather than the main library. The more valuable items, the ones that should not be handled casually." "Then do it," Samuel agreed. The work took another week, but at the end of it, the main room of the house was transformed. Beautiful pine shelving stretched from floor to ceiling, the wood still fresh and fragrant from the saw. Margaret had saved the center of the room by insisting on a reading area with comfortable chairs, good lamps, and a table large enough to spread out research materials. Samuel's office gained an entire wall of shelving with a rolling ladder to reach the upper sections. Then came the real work, moving the books to their new homes. Margaret had created a detailed system, each book assigned a specific location based on her cataloging. Samuel helped when he could, following her instructions on where each volume should be placed. She had a small filing box now, with index cards for every single book in alphabetical order by author, with notations indicating the shelf location. "This is remarkable," Samuel said one evening as they shelved the last of the agricultural texts. "I can actually find things now." "That is generally the point of a library," Margaret replied, but she was smiling, pleased with his appreciation. They were standing close together, both reaching for the same shelf, and Samuel became acutely aware of her proximity. She smelled like paper and leather and something floral he could not quite identify. When she turned to face him, they were mere inches apart and he saw her breath catch. "Samuel," she said softly, a question in her voice. He wanted to kiss her. The desire was so strong it was almost painful. But he was also terrified of ruining what they had built over these past months, the easy companionship and intellectual connection that had become the best part of his days. "Margaret, I need to tell you something," he began, but was interrupted by the sound of horses approaching at speed. They broke apart as heavy footsteps pounded across the porch, and one of the ranch hands burst through the door, breathing hard. "Boss, we have got trouble at the North Water access. Settlers from over the pass are trying to dam up the creek, saying they have prior rights." Samuel's expression hardened instantly, the tender moment vanishing as he shifted into the practical necessities of ranch management. "How many?" "At least a dozen men, maybe more. They have got tools and timber. If they get that dam built, it will cut off our best water source. Saddle my horse. Get Thomas and Henry armed and ready to ride." Samuel was already moving toward the gun cabinet in his office, his movements efficient and controlled. He pulled out a rifle and a revolver, checking both weapons with practiced ease. Margaret watched, her face pale. "Samuel, be careful. Is there no way to settle this without violence?" He paused, looking at her with an expression that was both gentle and resigned. "I will try talking first, but water rights are life or death out here. If they cut off our access, the cattle die, the ranch fails, and everything my father built is gone. I cannot let that happen. I understand. Just please come back safely." The urge to kiss her was overwhelming now, fueled by the adrenaline of impending conflict and the fear that he might not get another chance. But his men were waiting and there was no time. Instead, he caught her hand and squeezed it tightly. "I will come back. We have books to finish organizing, remember." Then he was gone, the door slamming behind him and hoofbeats thundering away into the gathering dusk. Margaret stood alone in the library they had built together, surrounded by thousands of words and stories, and found that none of them could quiet the fear rising in her chest. Chen appeared from the kitchen, his weathered face creased with concern. "Miss Margaret, you come have tea." "Boss will be fine. He knows how to handle trouble." But Margaret could not settle to tea or anything else. She tried to continue working, but found herself simply holding books without seeing them, her mind entirely focused on wondering what was happening at the northern creek. She had seen the hardness that came over Samuel when the ranch hand brought news of the trouble, the transformation from thoughtful scholar to determined frontier rancher. She understood it was necessary, but it also reminded her how precarious life was out here, how quickly violence could erupt over resources and rights. The hours crawled past with excruciating slowness. Full dark fell, and still there was no word. Chen tried to get her to eat dinner, but she could only manage a few bites before her stomach rebelled. She finally settled in one of the reading chairs with a book of poetry open in her lap, not reading but needing the comfort of its presence. It was past midnight when she heard the horses returning. She flew to the door and flung it open, relief flooding through her when she saw Samuel dismounting, apparently unharmed. The other men rode past toward the bunkhouses, looking tired but not wounded. Samuel climbed the porch steps slowly, and in the lamplight she could see the exhaustion etched into every line of his face. There was blood on his shirt, but he moved without pain, so she hoped it was not his. "Are you hurt?" she asked immediately. "No, the blood is from one of the settlers." He got belligerent and threw the first punch. I had to hit him hard enough to convince the others we were serious. He sank into a chair on the porch, suddenly looking every one of his 28 years and then some. "We reached a compromise. They can take water for personal use and their gardens, but they cannot dam the creek or divert the main flow. I had to show them the legal deed and water rights documentation. Thank God my father kept meticulous records. Margaret sat in the chair beside him, wanting to touch him but uncertain if it was appropriate. So it is settled, for now. They are recent arrivals from back east and did not understand how things work out here. They thought water was limitless like in whatever green place they came from. Once I explained the situation and they saw I had the law on my side, they backed down, but I had to make it clear I was willing to fight if they pushed it. I was terrified, Margaret admitted quietly, sitting here not knowing if you were hurt or worse. Samuel turned to look at her fully, and something in his expression made her heart race. Were you terrified for me specifically, or just generally worried about violence? For you, she whispered. Specifically and entirely for you. He reached out and cupped her face with his calloused hand, his thumb gently stroking her cheekbone. Margaret, these past months with you have been the happiest I can remember since my father was alive. You have not just organized my library. You have made me remember why the books matter, why beauty and ideas and conversation matter. You have organized my whole life into something that makes sense again. That sounds like more than just appreciation for a librarian, she said, her voice trembling slightly. It is much more than that. I am falling in love with you. I think I have been falling since the first day you walked through that door and looked at my chaos like it was a challenge you could not wait to tackle. Margaret felt tears prick her eyes, but these were the good kind, the overwhelming kind that came with unexpected joy. I love you too. I have been trying not to because I thought it would complicate everything, but I cannot help it. You are everything I did not know I was looking for when I came west. Samuel leaned forward and kissed her then, soft and careful at first, then deeper as she responded with equal passion. His lips were warm and tasted faintly of dust and coffee, utterly real and present. Margaret wound her fingers into his hair, pulling him closer, months of building tension and denied attraction finally finding release. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me," he said simply. "I know it is fast and probably impractical and you might want to think about it, but I do not want to wait or wonder or risk losing you. Marry me and make this your home, not just as my employee but as my wife and my partner in everything." "Yes," Margaret said without hesitation. "Yes, absolutely yes." They kissed again, and this time it was sweeter, gentler, a promise rather than just passion. When they finally went inside, Samuel insisted on walking her to the bunkhouse even though she would not be sleeping there much longer. At her door, he kissed her one more time, lingering and tender. "Tomorrow we will go into Nevada City and find whatever passes for a minister," he said. "Unless you want something more elaborate, I want to be your wife," Margaret replied. "The details do not matter to me." "Then tomorrow it is." They were married 3 days later by a circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Nevada City. The ceremony took place in the library they had built together, surrounded by books and the smell of fresh pine from the shelves. Chen served as one witness, and Samuel's foreman Thomas stood as the other. Margaret wore her best dress, a simple blue cotton that brought out her eyes, with wildflowers in her hair that Samuel had ridden out early to gather. The preacher spoke about partnership and commitment, about building a life together through good times and hard times. Samuel and Margaret exchanged simple gold bands that had belonged to Samuel's parents, resized by the jeweler in Virginia City. When the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Samuel kissed his bride with such tenderness that even the weathered ranch hands who had gathered to witness the ceremony found themselves wiping suspiciously damp eyes. Chen had prepared a feast for the wedding celebration, pulling out all his culinary skills to create dishes that blended his Chinese heritage with American frontier fare. The ranch hands joined them for the meal, toasting the newlyweds with whiskey and offering their sincere congratulations. It was simple and informal, nothing like the elaborate Boston weddings Margaret had attended in her youth, but it was perfect in its genuine warmth and community. As evening fell and the guests departed to their own cabins, Samuel and Margaret were finally alone as husband and wife. Samuel had spent the previous day moving Margaret's few possessions from the bunkhouse into the main house, clearing space in his bedroom and making it truly theirs rather than just his. "Are you happy?" he asked as they stood together looking out at the desert sunset, his arms wrapped around her from behind. "Deliriously," Margaret replied, leaning back against his chest. "Are you?" "More than I knew was possible." He turned her in his arms to face him. "I promise I will do everything I can to make you happy, to give you a good life here." "You already have," she assured him. "The books, the conversation, the way you treat me as an equal partner in everything, that is all I need." Their wedding night was tender and sweet. Two people who had been alone for so long finally finding home in each other's arms. Samuel was patient and gentle, mindful that this was new territory for Margaret, and she was brave and willing, trusting him completely. They learned each other slowly, mapping the geography of desire and connection with care and wonder. Afterwards, lying wrapped in each other's arms, Margaret traced patterns on Samuel's chest and asked, "What happens now?" "With the library, I mean. It is nearly finished." "Then you start the really important work," Samuel said. "Teaching me to appreciate what we have. I want to actually read these books, not just preserve them. I want us to read together, to discuss ideas, to keep my father's dream of being both civilized and frontier alive in a way he never quite managed." "I would like that," Margaret murmured, already half asleep. "We could start with the Shakespeare. Your father had a beautiful, complete works that deserves to be properly appreciated. They fell into a rhythm of married life that suited them both beautifully." Samuel continued running the ranch with the confidence of someone who knew the land and the cattle intimately. Margaret finished the library organization and then began the work of truly cataloging each volume, creating detailed records that noted edition, condition, and significant passages. But more importantly, she became Samuel's partner in ranch decisions, bringing her analytical mind to problems of water management, grazing rotation, and breeding strategy. In the evenings, they would sit together in the library and read, sometimes aloud to each other, sometimes in companionable silence with their chairs drawn close. They worked their way through Shakespeare and Chaucer, through the American transcendentalists and the British romantics, through histories of Rome and Greece and treatises on natural philosophy. The books became a shared language between them, a way of understanding the world and each other. Winter came to Nevada, cold and harsh in the high desert. Snow fell in January, blanketing the ranch in white and forcing the cattle into the lower pastures where they could still find forage. Samuel and Margaret spent long evenings by the fire, reading and talking and planning for the future. They spoke of expanding the ranch, maybe acquiring adjacent land that had come up for sale. They talked about children someday, about what kind of life they wanted to build. In March, Margaret discovered she was pregnant. She told Samuel one evening after dinner, simply and directly, and watched joy transform his face. "Are you certain?" he asked, coming around the table to kneel beside her chair. "As certain as I can be. I have missed my courses for 2 months and I have been ill in the mornings." "Unless you know another explanation." He laughed and pulled her into his arms, careful already of this precious new life growing inside her. "We are going to have a baby. "Margaret, we are going to be parents. Are you happy about it?" she asked, suddenly uncertain. "I know we did not exactly plan this yet." "I am thrilled," he assured her. "Absolutely thrilled. This house needs the sound of children. It has been too quiet for too long." The pregnancy progressed smoothly through spring and into summer. Margaret continued her library work as long as she was able, though Samuel became increasingly protective as her belly swelled. He would not let her climb the ladder anymore, insisted she rest in the heat of the afternoon, and fussed over her diet like a mother hen. "I am pregnant, not dying," she reminded him with exasperated affection when he tried to carry her across a puddle one afternoon. "I know, but you are carrying my child and I will not take any chances." Their son was born in November of 1884, during the first cold snap of the season. Margaret labored for 12 hours while a midwife from Nevada City attended her, and Samuel paced the floor outside like a caged animal. When the baby finally arrived, healthy and squalling, Samuel was allowed in to meet his child. "It is a boy," Margaret said tiredly, holding the tiny bundle against her chest. "We have a son." Samuel sat carefully on the edge of the bed, looking down at the small red face of his child with absolute wonder. "He is perfect. You are perfect. I cannot believe we made this." "What should we name him?" Margaret asked. They had discussed names but never settled on anything definite. Now, looking at his son, Samuel knew exactly what felt right. "William," he said. "After my father. William Quinn, so he will carry on my father's name and hopefully his love of learning." "William," Margaret repeated, testing the name. "Yes, that is perfect." Baby William transformed their lives in ways both exhausting and wonderful. The library became a place where Margaret nursed the baby while reading, where Samuel would hold his son and recite poetry, even though William could not possibly understand. Chen proved to have unexpected skills with babies, showing up with herbal remedies for colic and later creating special soft foods for when William started eating solids. Margaret proved to be a natural mother, patient and loving, but also practical. She refused to become so consumed by motherhood that she lost herself. She continued her library work during William's naps, continued reading and studying and engaging her mind. Samuel supported this completely, taking over childcare in the evenings so she could have time to herself. "You need to be Margaret as well as William's mother," he told her when she protested that she should be doing more with the baby. "You need your books and your thoughts and your own interests. That is what makes you who you are, and I fell in love with all of you, not just the parts that fit conventional ideas of womanhood." It was this kind of understanding that made Margaret fall more in love with her husband every day. He was not perfect. He could be stubborn about ranch decisions, got grumpy when the cattle proved particularly difficult, and sometimes forgot to take off his muddy boots before coming inside. But he was fundamentally good and kind and committed to their partnership in every way that mattered. William grew from infant to toddler, a bright, curious child who seemed to have inherited both his mother's love of books and his father's affinity for the land. He would toddle after Samuel around the ranch yard, trying to imitate everything his father did, but he also loved being read to and would sit with Margaret in the library for hours, looking at picture books and listening to her voice. When William was 2, Margaret became pregnant again. This time the pregnancy was harder, leaving her exhausted and ill through the first several months. Samuel hired a woman from town to help with household tasks and childcare so Margaret could rest. The baby, a girl they named Caroline, was born in the spring of 1887, smaller than William had been but healthy and strong. Now their family felt complete. Samuel would sometimes stand in the doorway of the library and watch Margaret reading to both children, William old enough now to sit still and listen while baby Caroline nursed and dozed. The sight filled him with such contentment he could barely stand it. This was what his father had wanted, he realized. Not just the books, but a life where literature and learning could coexist with the practical demands of frontier living. Not a choice between civilization and the West, but a synthesis of both. The years rolled past with the steady rhythm of ranch life. Seasons turned, cattle were bought and sold, water rights were defended, and the library grew as Samuel and Margaret continued acquiring books. William started reading on his own at age 4, devouring everything he could reach. Caroline proved equally bright, though more interested in the natural world than literature. She would collect specimens of plants and rocks, asking her parents endless questions about how things worked. They were not wealthy, but the ranch was profitable enough to provide comfortably. Samuel expanded operations carefully, buying another 200 acres when it became available and increasing the herd. Margaret continued her library work and also began writing, first just journals and letters, but eventually essays about frontier life and the role of literature in Western development. She submitted some to newspapers back east and was thrilled when they were accepted for publication. "You are going to be famous," Samuel teased when her third essay was published in a Boston literary magazine. "Hardly. But it is nice to contribute something to the world of ideas beyond just organizing other people's books." In 1890, when William was 6 and Caroline 4, a fire broke out in the southern pasture during a particularly dry summer. Samuel and his men fought it desperately, trying to keep it from spreading to the ranch buildings and the neighboring properties. The fire burned for 2 days before a sudden rainstorm finally doused the flames. When Samuel came home, exhausted and covered in soot, he found Margaret waiting for him with water and clean clothes and quiet understanding. "How bad is it?" she asked as he washed the grime from his face and hands. "We lost about 50 acres of grazing land and maybe 20 head of cattle. It could have been much worse. If that rain had not come when it did, we might have lost everything including the house." He dried his face and turned to look at her. "The library would have burned, Margaret. All those books, everything we have built." "But it did not burn," she said firmly. "The rain came, the fire stopped, and we are all safe. That is what matters. Books can be replaced, Samuel. You cannot be." He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight, feeling the solid reality of her against him. After 16 years of marriage, she was still his anchor, still the person who made sense of his world. "I love you," he said into her hair. "I never say it enough, but I love you more than I have words for." "I love you too. Always." The children grew and thrived. William proved to be a natural scholar, reading advanced texts by age 8 and asking questions that challenged even Margaret's extensive knowledge. Caroline was more physical, preferring to be outside helping with the cattle or exploring the desert landscape. Samuel taught her to ride almost before she could walk, and she took to it with fearless enthusiasm. "She is going to run this ranch someday," Samuel predicted when Caroline was 7 and had just successfully helped deliver a calf with minimal assistance. "What about William?" Margaret asked. "William is going to be a professor or a writer or something that uses that incredible mind of his." "He is brilliant, Margaret, truly brilliant. We need to make sure he gets proper education." They hired a tutor from Virginia City to supplement Margaret's teaching, a retired school teacher who came twice a week to work with both children on advanced subjects. The woman was impressed with their progress, particularly William's aptitude for languages and mathematics. When William turned 12 in 1896, they faced a difficult decision. The tutor suggested he needed more than she or even Margaret could provide now. He needed a real school, possibly even a university preparatory academy. He should go east, the tutor said bluntly. Boston or Philadelphia, somewhere with the resources to nurture a mind like his. The suggestion hung in the air of the library that evening after the children had gone to bed. Samuel and Margaret sat in their customary chairs, the lamps casting warm light over books that had been part of their lives for so long now. "I do not want to send him away," Samuel said finally. "He is 12 years old." "I do not want to either," Margaret agreed. "But we also cannot hold him back just because we will miss him. If he has the potential to do great things, we have to give him that opportunity." They wrote to schools in Boston, to Margaret's old contacts from her father's university days. Letters went back and forth through the winter. In the spring, William was accepted to a prestigious preparatory academy with a partial scholarship based on his evident abilities. He would live with Margaret's cousin in Boston and come home for summers. Sending William east on the train that August was one of the hardest things either Samuel or Margaret had ever done. Caroline cried openly, losing her brother and playmate. Margaret maintained composure until the train pulled away, then wept in Samuel's arms while Caroline clung to both of them. "Did we make the right choice?" Margaret asked that night as they lay in bed, the house feeling impossibly empty without William's presence. "I think so," Samuel said, though his voice was uncertain. "But I also think right choices can still hurt terribly." William came home that first summer full of stories about Boston, about his classes and the other students and everything he was learning. He had grown taller and spoke with more confidence, clearly thriving in the academic environment. He devoured books from the library with new understanding, discussing philosophy and science with a sophistication that made Margaret's heart swell with pride. But he was also homesick in ways he tried to hide. He missed the ranch, the open spaces, the easy companionship of his family. He had not quite fit in with the Boston boys, too Western in his habits and outlook, too straightforward for their subtle social hierarchies. "I belong here," he said to his parents one evening. "Not in Boston. This is home." "Boston is education," Margaret replied gently. "Home will always be waiting when you are done learning." "But what if I do not want what Boston offers? What if I want to run the ranch with Father, to live here and raise my own family here someday?" Samuel and Margaret exchanged glances, a whole conversation passing between them in that look. They had assumed William's brilliance meant he was destined for academic life, but perhaps they had been projecting their own values rather than listening to what he wanted. "Then you can do that," Samuel said firmly. "The ranch will be here, and it will be yours and Caroline's when I am gone. But finish school first. Get the education, learn everything you can, and then make an informed choice about what you want. You are only 13. You do not have to decide your whole life right now." Over the next several years, this became the pattern. William excelled at school but remained firmly rooted to his Western home. Caroline helped Samuel run the ranch, learning every aspect of cattle operations and land management. She was 16 now, and though Samuel knew he should probably worry about her marriage prospects, she showed no interest in any of the local boys. She wanted to run cattle, to expand operations, to try new techniques she read about in the agricultural journals. Margaret, now in her late 40s, had become a respected voice in Western literary circles. Her essays on frontier life and the importance of education and culture in developing territories were widely read. She maintained correspondence with scholars and writers across the country, the library serving as the heart of an intellectual network that stretched from Nevada to the Atlantic coast. Samuel was 51 now, weathered by years of sun and hard work, but still strong and vital. The ranch was more successful than it had ever been. their herd healthy and their land productive. He and Margaret still sat together in the library most evenings, still read and discussed ideas, still found joy in each other's company after nearly 2 decades of marriage. In 1899, William graduated from his preparatory academy at the top of his class. He was offered places at Harvard and Yale, full scholarships to pursue whatever field he desired. Samuel and Margaret made the long journey east for the graduation, bringing Caroline with them. It was Margaret's first time back to Boston since she had fled her stepfather nearly 20 years ago, and the city felt both familiar and utterly foreign. At the graduation celebration, William gathered his family and made his announcement. "I have decided to accept the Harvard offer, but I am going to study agricultural science and land management. I want to bring modern scientific methods to Western ranching. I want to take what I have learned here and apply it to what I love most, which is the ranch and the land." Samuel felt tears prick his eyes as he embraced his son. "Your grandfather would be so proud of you. He always believed we could be both things, both educated and practical, both civilized and frontier. You are going to prove him right." The new century arrived with hope and promise. William was at Harvard studying agriculture, while Caroline managed more and more of the ranch operations. She was 20 now, whip-smart, and completely capable, and Samuel increasingly trusted her judgment on major decisions. Margaret was working on a book, a memoir of her years in Nevada and her experience building a life in the West. Publishers back east were interested, seeing the commercial potential in stories of frontier women and Western development now that the Wild West was becoming more myth than reality. One evening in the summer of 1901, as Samuel and Margaret sat in the library with the windows open to catch the desert breeze, Samuel set down his book and looked at his wife with a contemplative expression. "What are you thinking?" Margaret asked, recognizing the look. "I am thinking about how my father would have loved all of this. Not just the organized library, though he would have appreciated that tremendously, but everything we have built. The family, the successful ranch, William's education, Caroline's competence, your writing. This synthesis of culture and frontier life that he always dreamed of. You have honored his memory beautifully," Margaret said softly. "We have," Samuel corrected. "None of this would have happened without you. You did not just organize books, Margaret. You organized my whole life, gave it structure and meaning and purpose beyond just survival. You give me too much credit. I do not give you nearly enough." He rose from his chair and crossed to where she sat, kneeling beside her just as he had when she told him about their first pregnancy. "Do you remember what I said when I asked you to marry me? You said I had organized your life into something that made sense. I said you organized my heart, that you had taken my loneliness and my chaos and turned it into chapters of something beautiful." He took her hand, the same hand he had held across the dinner table all those years ago. "That is still true. Every day with you is another chapter in the best story I could have imagined." Margaret leaned down to kiss him, her heart full of love for this man who had given her a home and a purpose and a partnership beyond anything she had dreamed possible when she stepped off that stagecoach in Nevada City 18 years ago. "I love you, Samuel Quinn," she said. Every chapter, every page, every word. They held each other there in the library surrounded by thousands of stories, knowing that theirs was still being written, still unfolding in ways both expected and surprising. William returned from Harvard in 1903 with his degree, and immediately began implementing new ranching techniques on the family land. He had ideas about selective breeding, rotational grazing, and water conservation that transformed the ranch's productivity. He worked alongside his father and sister, the three of them forming a formidable team. In 1904, Caroline finally showed romantic interest in someone, a young rancher from a neighboring property who shared her passion for cattle and land management. Samuel liked the young man, respected his work ethic and his genuine affection for Caroline. When they married that fall, it was on the ranch with family and friends gathered much as they had for Samuel and Margaret's wedding 20 years earlier. Margaret's memoir was published in 1905 to considerable success. A Library in the Desert, Life and Literature on a Nevada Ranch sold well back east, where readers were fascinated by her story of bringing culture and learning to the frontier. More importantly to Margaret, it resonated with Western women who recognized their own experiences in her words, who understood the challenge of maintaining intellectual life while managing the practical demands of frontier existence. William married in 1906, bringing home a bright young woman he had met at Harvard who shared his passion for agricultural innovation. She fit into the ranch family beautifully, and soon she and Caroline were fast friends, working together on expanding operations. Samuel was 62 now, ready to step back and let the younger generation take over active management. He still oversaw major decisions and helped with difficult tasks, but increasingly his days were spent in the library with Margaret, reading and writing and enjoying the fruits of their life's work. They had 4 grandchildren by 1910, with more on the way. The ranch house was full of noise and laughter again. Multiple generations living and working together on the land Samuel's father had claimed so many years ago. The library remained the heart of it all, a place where children came to hear stories, where the adults retreated for quiet contemplation, where the family gathered for important discussions. On their 30th wedding anniversary in 1914, Samuel and Margaret hosted a celebration that brought together their entire extended family and half the population of Nevada City. They stood together in the library, surrounded by the books that had brought them together, and renewed the vows they had made 3 decades earlier. "You are still the best decision I ever made," Samuel said as they danced slowly to music from a hired fiddle player. "You are still the best adventure I ever embarked upon," Margaret replied, resting her head on his shoulder. They were both gray now, lined by years and sun and life, but the love between them had only deepened with time. They knew each other completely, all the strengths and flaws and quirks that made them who they were. They had weathered droughts and fires and financial uncertainties. They had sent children away and welcomed them home. They had built something lasting and true. The years continued to pass with the steady rhythm they had established. Samuel and Margaret grew old together, still reading in their chairs by the fire, still discussing ideas and philosophy, still finding joy in books and each other. Samuel's health began to decline in his early 70s, the hard years of ranch work taking their toll, but he remained sharp mentally until the very end. He died in 1923 at age 73, quietly in his sleep after an evening spent reading Shakespeare with Margaret. She found him in the morning, peaceful and still, a book still open on his chest. The grief was profound but not bitter. They had been given 40 years together, far more than many couples got, and every one of those years had been full of love and partnership. Margaret lived another 12 years, remaining active and engaged until the very end. She continued writing, published 2 more books, and saw the ranch thrive under William and Caroline's management. She spent her days in the library that she and Samuel had built together, surrounded by the books that had defined their life. When she died in 1935 at age 76, it was also peacefully, sitting in her reading chair with one of Elizabeth Barrett Browning's sonnets open in her lap. The family found her there and knew she would have wanted no other end, surrounded by literature and love. William and Caroline buried their parents side by side on a hill overlooking the ranch, with a single shared headstone that reads simply, Samuel Quinn and Margaret Quinn. Together they built a library in the desert and a love that lasted lifetimes. The library remained the heart of the ranch house for generations to come. William's children and grandchildren grew up among those books, learning the same lessons about the compatibility of culture and frontier life that their great-grandfather had believed in and their grandmother had proven. The collection continued to grow, each generation adding their own volumes and stories. The original 3,000 books that had brought Samuel and Margaret together were carefully preserved and cataloged, treated as treasures not just for their literary value, but for what they represented. The foundation of a love story that had transformed two lonely people into a family legacy. Caroline's great-granddaughter, doing research on family history in the 1980s, found Margaret's original cataloging notebooks in a trunk in the library. She carefully turned the pages, reading her great-great-grandmother's neat handwriting noting each book's location and condition. Tucked between the pages was a letter, yellowed with age, written in Samuel's hand and dated 1913. My dearest Margaret, it read, I am writing this on the eve of our 29th anniversary, and I find myself overwhelmed with gratitude for the life we have built. You came to organize my library, and instead, you organized my entire existence into something beautiful and meaningful. Every book on these shelves reminds me of you, of conversations we have shared, of ideas we have explored together, of the intellectual partnership that has been as important to our marriage as any romantic feeling. You took my loneliness and my chaos and created chapters of joy. You are, and will always be, the greatest story I have ever known. All my love forever, Samuel. The great-granddaughter carefully refolded the letter and placed it back in the notebook, tears streaming down her face. This was what love looked like, she thought. Not just passion and romance, though those were important, but this deep partnership, this intellectual and emotional connection that lasted through decades and difficulties. Samuel and Margaret had built something that transcended their individual lives, creating a legacy that still shaped their family more than 50 years after their deaths. The ranch continued for many more generations, evolving with the times but maintaining its essential character. The library remained central to family life, a testament to the belief that culture and practical living could not just coexist, but enhance each other. New books were added, old ones were carefully preserved, and the original cataloging system that Margaret had created was maintained and updated by each generation. The story of the librarian who came west to organize books and stayed to build a life became family legend, told and retold to each new generation of children. It was a reminder that love could be found in unexpected places, that intellectual connection could be as powerful as physical attraction, and that two people working together could create something far greater than either could achieve alone. The bunkhouse where Margaret had first stayed still stood, converted now into a guest house for visiting family members. The main house had been expanded over the years, but the original library room remained largely unchanged. The same pine shelving Samuel's ranch hands had built in 1883 still holding books along the walls. The reading area where Samuel and Margaret had spent thousands of evenings together was preserved almost as a shrine, their original chairs still positioned by the fireplace. Visitors to the ranch, seeing the extensive library in what had once been rugged frontier territory, always asked the same question: how did this come to be here? And the family would tell them about Samuel Quinn, who inherited 3,000 books and no way to organize them, and Margaret Daniels, who answered an advertisement and found not just employment but her life's great love. They would talk about how Margaret organized not just books but a lonely cowboy's heart, arranging his chaos into chapters of meaning and joy that lasted their entire lives. The love story of Samuel and Margaret became more than just family history. It became a reminder that the West was built not just by cowboys and cattle drives, but by people who brought culture and learning, who insisted that civilization and frontier did not have to be opposing forces. It showed that love could grow from intellectual connection as easily as from physical attraction. That partnership could be based on shared values and interests as much as passion. Their story demonstrated that happily ever after was not just a fairy tale ending, but something that could be built through daily choices, through commitment to shared goals, through maintaining connection even as life evolved and changed. Samuel and Margaret had faced droughts and fires, financial uncertainties and family challenges, but through it all they had maintained the foundation they built in those early days over dinner table conversations and evenings reading together in the library. The books they had so carefully organized became more than just volumes to be read. They became symbols of everything Samuel and Margaret had believed in and built together. The idea that beauty mattered even in harsh circumstances, that ideas could flourish alongside cattle operations, that a life could be both practical and poetic. Each volume on those shelves represented a conversation they might have had, an idea they might have explored, a moment of connection in their decades together. As the 20th century gave way to the 21st, the ranch and its library continued to stand as testaments to their vision. The family that grew from their union maintained the values they had established. Education mattered, culture mattered, but so did hard work and connection to the land. They were scholars and ranchers, readers and writers, people who could discuss philosophy while delivering calves and quote poetry while mending fences. The catalog system Margaret created had been digitized now, but the original index cards were preserved in the library's archives, each one bearing her careful handwriting noting the location and details of individual volumes. They were artifacts of her work, yes, but also of her love, each card representing hours spent in that library while Samuel was out working the ranch, each notation a small piece of the foundation they were building together. On the shelves alongside all the books Margaret had cataloged were newer editions that documented the life she and Samuel built together. Photo albums showing their wedding day, William and Caroline as children, the expanding family through the years. Margaret's published books sat there too, her memoir and essays that had shared their story with the wider world. Letters between Samuel and Margaret during the periods when one or the other had to travel were carefully preserved in archival boxes, creating a written record of their ongoing conversation that spanned decades. The library in the desert that Margaret had organized stood as more than just a collection of books. It was a living monument to the possibility of building beauty in harsh places, of maintaining culture on the frontier, of finding love where you least expected it. It proved that two people who shared values and interests and genuine affection could create something that lasted far beyond their own lives, something that shaped generations and inspired everyone who encountered their story. Samuel and Margaret's love story had no dramatic plot twists or grand gestures beyond that first marriage proposal. Instead, it was built on thousands of small moments, shared meals and evening conversations, books read aloud and ideas discussed, the steady accumulation of years lived in partnership and mutual respect. It was the kind of love that sustained rather than consumed, that grew deeper rather than burning out, that proved that happily ever after was not an ending but a daily choice renewed again and again. Their story ended as all stories must, with death taking first one and then the other. But what they built together did not end. It continued in the children and grandchildren who carried forward their values, in the ranch that still operated on principles they had established, in the library that remained the heart of family life, and in the legend that inspired each new generation to believe that love built on genuine partnership could weather any storm and create something beautiful that would last long after the lovers themselves were gone.